All right, welcome everyone to what we learned about gender discrimination and sexual harassment in public history. We will get started in just a minute here as we see everyone filing in from the Zoom waiting room, but thank you all for joining us. We'll get started in just a second. But in the meantime, if you want to introduce yourselves and where you're joining us from in the chat, you are welcome to do so. It's nice to see so many folks joining us today. All right. So welcome to what we learned about gender discrimination and sexual harassment in public history. My name is Stephanie Rao. I'm the executive director at the National Council on Public History, and my pronouns are she, her. A few quick housekeeping notes before we really dig in. Zoom's live auto captions are enabled for this webinar, and to view those captions, just click on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom bar. Second, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to all who signed up for the workshop, as well as the NCPH and AASLH communities via the AASLH YouTube channel and the NCPH website. And last, please be reminded that all NCPH events, such as this one, require attendees to abide by our events code of conduct. I would like to take a minute to introduce who you're going to hear from today and what our plan of presentation is. So first, Mary Rizzo, who is co-chair of NCPH's board-led subcommittee on gender discrimination and sexual harassment, will introduce how we came to this work and how we came to partnering with AASLH on this survey. And then Heidi Karchner and Tammy Messick-Cherry from Oberg Research, the firm we contracted with to analyze the survey data, will give us an overview of the report itself. And then John Dichtel and Bethany Hawkins, our project partners from AASLH, and myself will share some early reflections and takeaways from the report. And once those remarks and presentations conclude, we're going to welcome questions from all of you. You will be prompted to use the Q&A feature to share your questions with us. And there is an anonymous question function if you want to be able to ask something that way. And during that Q&A, we hope to begin the process of finding out what your priorities are for future work coming out of this report. So thank you again for joining us today. And now I will turn it over to Mary.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you all for attending today. I know that it's not easy to make time for another Zoom call in your life, so I really do appreciate the commitment that you guys are all showing to this issue. So as Stephanie said, I'm just going to talk very briefly in sort of a prefatory way to explain how we got to where we are today, and then to kind of set up what our colleagues at Oberg are going to really dig into, which is what you're all really here for, which is the analysis of our survey results. So not to go too far back in history, right? But you all remember, I'm sure, around 2017 when the Me Too discussions were happening very publicly about issues around sexual harassment and gender discrimination in our various areas of employment and work. And one of the things that became clear is that there was very little discussion happening about what was going on with these issues in public history. So our diversity and inclusion task force decided to take on that question. What did it mean to think about the problems of sexual harassment and gender discrimination in public history writ large, meaning the field as broadly construed as we know that it is. This led to a variety of events and activities. In 2018, we held an on-the-fly session at the NCPH conference. That was a way for us to kind of begin to get a sense of what was going on and what people had experienced in the field, but obviously in a limited way because it was limited to people who were able to attend that conference session. But it was really eye-opening, and it became very clear to us that these were issues that were affecting us and our field. At the 2019 NCPH conference, there were formal conference sessions that again delved into these issues. There were informal discussions that were taking place in and around the conference on these issues as well. What this led to was the creation of the subcommittee that Stephanie mentioned, the Gender Discrimination and Sexual Harassment Subcommittee, which is co-chaired by myself and Kristen Baldwin-Dethridge. Now, the subcommittee has done a lot of work beyond the survey, but we're here, of course, to focus on the survey. So I'm not going to talk very much about what the subcommittee has been doing. I will put into the chat a link to a History at Work blog post that gives you a little bit better of a sense of the sort of larger work that our subcommittee has been doing for the last couple of years. But the reason why we decided to do a survey is that as we began to research this topic more, it became very clear that the only material that was out there was very anecdotal. And that while there were some more rigorous data collected about art museums, for example, there wasn't, or about universities, there wasn't anything that thought through the breadth of places that public historians do their work. And so we decided, maybe a little naively, that we would do our own national survey in order to gather some of that data. And we thought that it's important to do this because there are still, and I would say there are still plenty of people who don't think that these are issues in our field. And we felt like a survey would show that that these are topics that we need to address. And of course that our professional organizations, NCPH and AASLH, are taking these very seriously. So our vision and goals for the survey, just very briefly to give you a sense of what we were thinking as we were developing the survey. First and foremost, we wanted this survey to be survivor oriented, right? And to center the voices of people who have experienced gender discrimination and sexual harassment. So what does that mean? Well, it means that in the survey, there are a lot of open-ended questions, right, that allow people to describe their own experiences in their own words. That we thought as public historians, right, was incredibly important for those reasons of centering those voices. As I'm sure our colleagues at Oberg will discuss, that also makes it very difficult or challenging, I should say, to analyze that data. So we wanted to hear those voices and gather those voices, but also it ended up being a challenge as well as we are understanding what's coming out of those stories. And I will say personally, it is incredibly humbling to read the stories that people told in this survey. We have been entrusted with taking care of people's very difficult personal experiences. And as someone who has personally experienced gender discrimination and sexual harassment in various jobs, I am, and I still am, surprised and horrified by what the survey has revealed to us that people are experiencing. But at this point, you know, we've conducted the survey, we've gathered our data, but our goal here is not to just like pat ourselves on the back and say, yep, we did it, let's move on. Our goal here is to figure out what this leads us to next, right? What are our next steps building on this? What is the action that comes out of this? What are the actions that come out of this? And this is, of course, why we're gathered here today, because we really want to hear from you all. The last thing I want to say is about the language, word choices that we have used in the report. So our committee has really been informed by thinking around restorative justice practices. And I have to shout out, particularly on our committee, Kristen Baldwin-Dethridge, Samantha Rosenthal, Chell Miller, and Joan Zenzen, as people who have really dived into restorative justice as a framework and have offered a lot of thoughts about how we apply that in these areas. One of the outcomes of that is the language that we used in this report. So you will see as you look at the report that people who have experienced gender discrimination and sexual harassment are referred to interchangeably as survivors or victims, but that the people who are doing these actions are called perpetuators. And that may be a slightly unfamiliar term, it's unfamiliar to me, but instead of calling them perpetrators, we decided to use the term perpetuator as a way to acknowledge that these folks are often perpetuating societal oppressions that are happening every day, and larger systems of oppression that affect us. And that we think the word perpetuator helps to indicate that change is possible, and that this is not someone's identity forever, but that we can transform these systems as well. So we hope that it is a hopeful word to use. So that's all I'm going to say as a lead in to what we're going to hear now from our colleagues at Oberg.
Okay, thank you, Mary, and thank you to the whole team that put this together and has been working on it. Okay, we'll hop in. Is there any way we could get Tammy and I both at the same time? We're going to kind of be, there we go. There's Tammy. Hi. Okay. So I am Heidi Karchner, and this is Tammy Messick-Cherry. Both of us use the she, her pronouns, and we are with Oberg Research, which is an audience research and evaluation company. And we were contracted by the team to come in and take this. The survey had a massive, great response. And so we were brought in to analyze it because that's what we love to do. So we didn't write the survey. We didn't administer it. That was all the committee that did that. We just took the data and analyzed it. But the survey was open and being advertised between September 2020 and November 2021. The incidents described often don't have like a time frame connected to them. So we haven't been able to pinpoint if these are happening in the last like 5 to 10 years, if they were happening in 2020, or if they were happening a while ago, but that is okay. There's also, to keep in mind, this is a convenient sample. So the survey was put out in a lot of different places, and we asked for a lot of responses from a lot of different places. However, it's not a population sample. So we want to be careful when extrapolating these results to the whole field. However, these results, the numbers we have, the experiences we have, tell a pretty important story and tell a story of what's going on in the field. Let's see, there were 440 participant responses. And the participants included people from all over the public history field, including universities, museums, historic sites, libraries, archives, etc. The quotes, like Mary was saying, the quotes in this report are we've been given permission to use them. But on the survey, there was a question asked, like, can we share your words anonymously? And people who said yes, we are sharing from their quotes, and people who said no, we are not sharing. So, there we go.
Okay. So one of the things that in the survey that was asked was how people defined gender discrimination and or sexual harassment. One of the best ways for us to better understand what we were seeing and what we weren't seeing from these definitions that people provided was to take some definitions we were already familiar with from the Equal Employment Opportunity Office and kind of lay them on top of what people were saying to see if there were any trends that were falling outside of that definition. And if so, then we could kind of get a better sense of what was going on and what thoughts people were having within the field. I will read to you those definitions so that you are familiar with the ones that we were utilizing. They were, for gender discrimination, we were using the definition that says sex discrimination involves treating someone, an applicant or employee, unfavorably because of that person's sex, including the person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or pregnancy. And then for sexual harassment, the definition that we were using is, it is unlawful to harass a person, job applicant, or employee because of that person's sex. Harassment can include sexual harassment or unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature. Once we applied those on top to kind of get a breadth and depth and understanding of other people's definitions, of the participants' definitions, we found that they were largely the same and consistent with the definitions that we had used. So while we don't necessarily want to say that those are the quote unquote correct definitions for our field necessarily, they did seem to feel that they did seem to give definitions that were in line with those. We didn't see any strong trends that would show that there were other things that those were missing. The survey respondents were also largely familiar with incidents of gender discrimination and or sexual harassment in the workplace. So they were given an opportunity to report whether they or someone they knew had experienced sexual harassment or gender discrimination in the workplace. 76% reported that they had experienced with it personally, and 61% reported that they knew someone who had. I will note that we don't have a lot of information about those who had not experienced gender discrimination or did not know anyone who had experienced gender discrimination and or sexual harassment in the workplace. And that would be something that I would say we could learn more about in the future, are who is and who isn't having these experiences within the workplace. Can we go back? Well, I'll say next slide when I'm ready. Okay. So we know that while, as Heidi had said, that there were, 43% of participants also had experienced or knew someone who had experienced 5 or more instances of gender discrimination or sexual harassment in the field. So they were asked how many instances that they knew of, and 43% had knowledge of 5 or more. So nearly half had a very large, in this case, percentage of, or had a very large understanding and had multiple instances that they were aware of. I'll say it that way. So I want to note that we, again, don't know if this is true for the field overall. More research is needed to understand the prevalence within the field, but we do see incidents that are widely across the public history field, and it is evident that this is occurring within public history. And to know exactly what degree, we aren't sure, but it is definitely there. Okay, next slide.
And one thing I forgot to say earlier, all of you listening, please take care of yourselves. This can be a heavy subject to listen to. And if it becomes too much, no offense will be taken, just if you need to drop off. And we're happy to talk more. Anyways, okay. So on the survey, participants were asked to categorize the type of incident, I'm sorry. Okay, they're asked to categorize it. They were given about 12 options and they could select as many as they wanted to categorize their instance. The top 4 are here on the slide. The most common one was boundaries being crossed, which was defined on the survey as having personal, professional, emotional, or physical boundaries crossed without one's consent. Examples include unwanted attention, compliments, advances, invitations, or physical contact. The next most common was microaggressions, which was described as being subjected to remarks or behaviors that implicitly target real or perceived characteristics or identities, sometimes called microaggressions, and examples include harmful jokes, backhanded compliments. Next was people being treated differently, which was defined as excluded or treated differently than others, and examples include not receiving as much support or guidance as others, asked to do more or different types of work than others, or having your work valued differently than others. And next was remarks or disruptive behavior, defined as being subjected to remarks or behaviors that are disruptive to educational or professional activities, performance, or free time. Next slide.
Okay, so in this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about who was reported as being impacted for gender discrimination and sexual harassment. I want to note that the demographic characteristics that were reported were not necessarily known characteristics of the individuals involved. They were reported by the participants. So because they were invited to report incidents that they may or may not have actually personally been in, there are some where they are making assumptions about the individual's characteristics that are involved. So we have a sense for trends, but we don't have a full picture of exactly who and all the demographic characteristics of who were involved in these incidents. So again, that's where I would hope that in the future, we could get more data and information and research about exactly who is being impacted. So from what we can tell, both the survivor and the perpetuator are largely reported as white. The survivors were most likely to report themselves or others as a woman, and perpetuators were most likely to be reported as a man. Survivors were most frequently within the 25 to 34 age category and skewed a little bit on the younger side. The perpetuators were described as a bit older, with the 55 to 64 category as the largest age group. So in about half of the instances, participants felt that age was also a factor in the discrimination or harassment, that there was a twofold issue going on, that there was gender discrimination and or sexual harassment, and also age was a factor. People also reported that race and class were factors, with one participant stating, "I, a cisgender Black woman, was in my 30s, harassed by a white man in his 50s, who was my supervisor, who used a derogatory term for a Black trans person, and when I objected, they set out to punish me for the remainder of my employment." If you are interested in the full demographic characteristics of those that we know of from the report or from this survey, they are in the report that was sent out prior to this presentation. Next slide.
Okay, expanding a little bit more on who is impacted. Most frequently, the perpetuators were reported as being supervisors or colleagues. And then next is they were reported as being site visitors or board members. So a lot of the discrimination and harassment is coming internally from organizations with people in close proximity who are working together. But it's also a good reminder that discrimination and harassment can come like externally too. So we need to not only be aware of, the employees we're working with, but also as a field who works with the public and board members and donors. Those interactions are also ones in which incidents occur. We found that the reported incidents largely occurred in the workplace, which it means the workplace and then on university campuses as well. And we found that incidents that were reported occurred in both large and small institutions at about the same rate. Participants were asked how big their organizations were, and the rate of where this is happening was similar in both sides of the institutions. Another thing to be aware of is that while many of these instances are happening within the workplace, they're also happening when employees are off-site. So like if they're visiting a sister organization or at like another location, they're at a restaurant or a work party, or while they're traveling to conferences or something like that, these instances are occurring there as well. So in organizations and in planning, that we should have plans and prepare for issues that could happen when employees are off-site. Next slide.
I will add to that, Heidi, that we did see some, not a lot, but some instances occurring online as well, which shouldn't be too surprising, but we were seeing reports of that too. So participants were asked to share whether or not or how they reported the instances that occurred to either them or someone that they knew. And in just under a third of cases, participants share that the victim or survivor reported the incidents to an organization, right? Like formally reported it. We did find, though, that the victim or survivor was more likely to confide in others, like friends, colleagues, more in an informal way, than to report it to an organization. Next slide.
Thank you. So the participants were also asked to share reasons for not reporting in an open-ended question. And the top 3 categories for reasons they wouldn't report are here. They were afraid of repercussions of reporting. One participant said that because this man is so famous, I did not want to go public with my story, as I did not want that to define my professional identity, and I did not want to be harassed online. Next, most frequent, they thought that the complaint would not be taken seriously. One participant said, who would I have reported the incident to? Women being touched and verbally assaulted on the streets is considered almost normal life in the US. And then another category reason for not reporting is that they did not think it rose to the level of a complaint. So one participant said that this did not rise to the level of reporting, although I do think it adversely impacted my career. So we're seeing adverse impacts and suffering from it, but people feeling like it's still not like it's not bad enough to report. Next slide.
Participants were asked what happened after the incident. So in over a third of instances, the victim or survivor took the initiative to assert themselves or to stay away from the perpetuator. So in this quote here, it says, I stayed away from the man as much as possible, and he never tried to inappropriately touch me again. A trend that we really did see in the data was that the burden of action was falling on the survivor to take steps to avoid the perpetuator to prevent future incidents. So let's see. Okay. In over a, let's see. Okay. In nearly a third of instances, the perpetuator continued as usual. So in this case, someone said the board president acted like nothing had happened. And in a quarter of incidents, the organizations did nothing. So in this instance, someone reported that he was not removed from his position and continued being involved with the organization and others in the community. Next slide.
Okay, so on the survey, participants were given the chance to report whether or not they were satisfied with the resolution of the incident. And it was it was reported more on a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we had people who were not satisfied with the resolution at all. Like this participant who said he was not reassigned or let go. It was decided he would be talked to by his direct supervisor. However, the unwanted advances continued. The staff member didn't want to come forward because she was afraid of what might happen given his level of authority. So we saw that on one end of the spectrum all the way to incidents that were satisfactorily resolved, with one person saying, my coworker, a salaried employee, witnessed one of the acts of sexual harassment, unwanted physical contact, and immediately reported it to HR. My harasser was fired the next day. So when we look at numbers for these, we had 46% of the incidents, 46% of these people were saying they were not satisfied with the resolution. And we only had 16% of people saying that they were fully satisfied with the resolution of the incident. Next slide.
Participants were asked what resources that they used to process the experiences that they had reported here in the survey. People reported using internal colleagues, using resources that were available in the field, such as the NCPH job site, the Gender Equity in Museums Movement site, and other blogs. People also reported using friends and family and mental health professionals. There were a number of people who reported that they had no resources available to them and used or used no resources, with one individual saying, "None. I processed it myself and moved on." Next slide.
Participants were asked for what resources they wished they had. And the responses could be categorized into training, policy change, and a more robust HR. Sorry, OR is my company, HR. And so an example of training, one participant wanted others to have a better understanding of power imbalances in the workplace and an understanding that if lighthearted teasing hurts, it's not okay. In terms of policy change, we had some individuals frustrated with how visitors are allowed to interact with them and how they had no say in, like, they have no power to control those interactions. So for example, this person asked to create internal policies giving employees the agency and power to speak up to visitors when they say and do inappropriate or derogatory things and commit sexual assault. And I believe that was in context of like touching a costume or historical clothing that somebody was wearing at the time. In terms of more robust HR, we saw some trends of people saying that they wanted access to any kind of HR support at all, to people saying that their HR departments are no longer in-house, but they've been moved to being managed by a governing or a state personnel office. So they don't quite have that connection. And we had people saying that their HR departments don't actually have the power to remove staff, and that's less than helpful. Okay, next slide.
Participants were asked about restitution, resolution, and restorative justice, and what that meant to them in regards to sexual harassment and gender discrimination in the field. People felt that it was really important for the behavior to be stopped. With one person saying, "Today it means that the discrimination/harassment would be dealt with immediately at work, eliminated, and the perpetrator would stop or have to leave." In another case, someone else said, "Taking steps to ensure the incident never happens again and working to ensure the victim feels supported, safe, and treated equally." And as we can see from what Heidi was talking about in terms of the satisfaction, that people were not satisfied generally with the result. And a lot of it was because the perpetrator was allowed to continue their behavior as usual. They also felt that follow through was really important. So following through on policies that were already in place, with one participant stating correction of the problem with input from established policy and those affected by the transgression. There were a number of people who reported that they felt that resolution, any kind of resolution, restitution, etc., was not possible, that they felt that there was nothing that anyone could do to give them that resolution. And with one person saying, "There was no way for me to resolve my situation or receive proper restitution at such a small organization. I had no choice but to leave my dream job." So in that case, we're seeing someone from a small institution feeling like they had nothing that could support them and no way of handling the situation, which ended in a very sad result. And so I think it's important to remember that these things can, like we said before, they can happen in both large and small institutions, and that it's important to have processes in place and resources available to help people process and deal with these situations. Next slide.
Okay. In terms of addressing sexual harassment and gender discrimination in the future, the participants mentioned some things that they thought could help. For one, first of all, would be actively promoting a safe environment. For example, they suggested that the daily, even hourly occurrences of physical and verbal abuse that frontline staff put up with could also be dealt with by signage throughout the site, reminding visitors how to behave, or whoever is selling the tickets should have to remind visitors of proper behavior. It was also requested that some empowering of victims. For example, that could look like having more women in positions of authority, though programs as university and museum staffs are generally mostly female, it is still often men in the highest positions. If there are more women in positions of authority who take these issues seriously, they can support the women under them. Also, enforcement of policies. One participant was asking for actual serious policies that are enforced, rules of behavior for visitors that are enforced, and notices to site partners as to incidents such as stalking and abuse. They were also asking for really strong policies to protective policies. So for example, in serious cases, there needs to be professional consequences such as termination, demotion for harassment, along with a hard look at the workplace culture. And the other thing that we saw a lot is that people were saying that acting quickly to intervene is critical. And again, as seen throughout the results of the survey, perpetuators are most frequently able to just continue as usual, and it's up to the victim to stand up to or avoid the perpetuator. And institutions need to protect our survivors and put a stop to behaviors from the perpetuators and enforce the consequences. Next slide. And we have some information there on getting help when you need help. And there's other further resources in the written report. I believe we go over to Stephanie now.
Thank you, Heidi and Tammy. I really appreciate that overview, and the link to the full report is in the chat. While you all work to digest that massive amount of information that Heidi and Tammy just provided you with, and think about what questions you have for our organizations, which you can put in the Q&A. We, AASLH and NCPH, wanted to take a few minutes to share some kind of initial reflections that we have on this work. So I will go first. And I want to step back for a second and thank the many folks who contributed to this essential work. The representatives from NCPH's board-led subcommittee on gender discrimination and sexual harassment, and Bethany, John, and the volunteers from AASLH's community who provided essential input into the construction of the survey and the language that we use to describe our work, which Mary talked about at the beginning. This project has been emotionally challenging for many of us in terms of content, and the full team's commitment to doing this thoroughly, thoughtfully, and carefully is greatly appreciated. I also want to thank each of our over 400 survey respondents for participating with us. In some cases, we asked you to dig into your past, perhaps reopening wounds you thought had healed. And in others, we asked you to describe recent instances, perhaps not yet even fully processed. I do not think it's possible to overemphasize the debt that we owe you for your honesty. And I hope that for at least a few of you, that the opportunity to be heard in this way by AASLH and NCPH has been healing, or at least validating. NCPH is committed to honoring the trust that you showed us. The final product may have not answered all the questions that we had at the start, and some issues with the survey's construction obscured some of the conclusions we hope to be able to make. But as public historians know, when engaging in community and trust building work, the process is as important as the result. And our consultative and democratic approach to this work occasionally meant sacrificing more traditional survey strategies in order to care for those with which we're seeking to engage. And I really appreciate Oberg Research's suggestions for work that we can do in the future and having them as partners in this project. I do not take your willingness to share your experiences with us lightly, and this is not the beginning or the end of our work on these issues here at NCPH. I am committed to calling out sexual harassment and gender discrimination in our field, but the work to address these issues should not rest solely on the shoulders of those who have been and are victims or survivors. It is all of our duties. If you have not experienced these issues, please still read the report in its entirety and hear these experiences, believe these experiences, and work to become an ally. And if you have experienced sexual harassment or gender discrimination in the field and did not respond to the survey, we still see you, we still believe you, and we are still going to work for you. Moving forward, NCPH's Gender Discrimination and Sexual Harassment Committee is already working to craft organizational policies around these issues using a restorative justice lens, and it is my hope that the feedback in this survey and report will help move that work forward and perhaps for it to be a model to others in the field. And we look forward to hearing more from all of you about what support systems, programs, and resources might be the most immediately useful to you all. So thank you. And now I will turn it over to my colleagues from AASLH, John and Bethany.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Heidi and Tammy. And I would echo all of Stephanie's remarks. Very well said. Thank the respondents who took the time and gave us their trust to a certain degree. And I would also want to acknowledge other studies and other efforts that have come before this. I think two people that are probably participating in this call are probably on the Zoom webinar with us, Ann Ackerson and Joan Baldwin. I know they did a study in 2018, May of 2018, that had fewer questions, I think, and maybe not as many respondents, but some of their findings were similar. They found that 76% of their respondents had experienced sexual harassment or gender discrimination, and I think 61% knew someone who had, and those findings are very close to the number that jumps out from this report of 62% having either been the victim or knowing someone. So I just think it's important to acknowledge those other surveys, which then leads to this next observation that any good survey unearths questions and causes one to, in retrospect, look back at the way you put the questionnaire together and wish you had done it differently. So any good survey always generates the desire to do another survey and to do more research. So just like that 2018 survey, in some ways, I'm sure was inspiring for this one, this group, NCPH and AASLH and our committees involved and other people we've talked to were already talking about what would the next survey look like. So there's definitely a commitment to do that, to be a little more focused if we could. And I think one of the things I think we all wish we could have done differently with this survey is to have a better sense of time, as historians, wanting to know when a certain event happened, I think can be very important. Especially when you look at the finding about, for example, that Heidi and Tammy went over about the low proportion of respondents who actually reported what happened to them. And when you think about the environment in which those individuals were, in their community, at their workplace, and in American society, in general, that kind of environment would have been very different, I think, 10 or 15 years ago than it would have been in the last few years post Me Too. So I think some kind of survey that could get at, what are the conditions today, and what kind of help, what kind of resources from NCPH or AASLH that we could help provide would be most useful now, might be the kind of step that we're thinking about next. And then the last thing I'll say is I went back through 14 years of conference, annual meeting programs from NCPH and AASLH, and 14 years because that's pretty much all that we have online. And just did a quick search for gender discrimination, sexual harassment kinds of sessions. And I was pretty surprised to find that, I guess in some ways it's not surprising, but also it feels very surprising now that there was nothing between 2008 and 2017. It wasn't until 2017 that AASLH did a session on gender equity and discrimination, and that was actually put together by Joan Baldwin and Ann Ackerson. And then in 2019, NCPH at their Hartford conference had a couple of sessions that I think came out of this board-led committee. And then AASLH did it as well that year, and both organizations have done it since. But I think that last point that I want to end on is just thinking about the role that associations play. We can't be the eyes and the ears and the ground everywhere, but associations, professional associations, provide some of that larger connective tissue and represent the larger public history communities in which individual organizations and individuals work, and where reporting structures or policies or conditions are lacking in those individual places, the organizations can help provide a whole range of spaces for conversation and discussion, for raising issues, committees to investigate and to propose, make recommendations, more research, surveying. Those are all things that we can provide. We can also help get sort of templates or model practices and policies from our members and share those more widely. And that's probably where we are most effective, is in sharing that kind of information that people are already figuring out on their own, and helping to disseminate that. So I will turn it over to Bethany.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I know we had a conversation when you brought that information about the fact that you could find nothing in annual meeting programs. And I know you were fairly surprised by that, and I really wasn't, because it wasn't something that was talked about. Women in the field have been experiencing this, since the beginning, but it wasn't something that we felt that we had, I guess, the permission or the safety to talk about. And so I think that's one thing that's really important about this survey that we're putting out is, victim voices were prioritized in this, and it is going to hopefully spark some change, at least in letting people know that AASLH and NCPH are organizations that care about this and are safe places. There are safe places that you can find within these organizations if this is something that you're going through. And it also made me think a lot when I was reading through the survey about the makeup of AASLH's members, and just my experience in the field at a small historic house museum, and how so many folks are, especially the women, are coming straight out of grad school, and maybe they get an executive director position. They're the only staff person. They're dealing with a board of directors and visitors, and have no training on what to do. And I really see that as a role of AASLH that we can play moving forward, is to provide training, to provide sample documents, maybe even, third-party connections where people can get that support. If they don't have an HR department, it's just them and maybe the board president, things like that. And honestly, until I read this, I had never really thought about sexual harassment coming from visitors, although I should have. I was a high school student giving tours at a historic house. But that's, I think, is another thing that we don't talk about, and the need for training on how to respond to that and how to make sure you have the right policies in place, I think, are some things that are going to come out of this survey, at least on AASLH's side. So hopefully, we can provide things that will be useful, and helping prevent some of these instances, giving people permission to speak out about them if it happens to them or to a colleague, which I think is equally important. And then especially giving folks who may not have an HR structure in their organizations and not know where to go, some guidance for moving forward.
Thank you, Bethany and John. And I think that leads really well into the first question that we've had pop up in the Q&A. And I think you've started to address it really nicely, which is, something I found challenging. How do you see the ability of a professional society like NCPH or AASLH to influence the policies of the survivors' workplace institutions? For example, to influence a museum's HR, personnel policies, and workplace culture. And I think Bethany and Joan are absolutely right that AASLH is in a fantastic position to be able to provide sample policies, training opportunities. A couple of ideas that came up in a joint listening session that our two organizations held in 2019 in Philadelphia at the AASLH conference that I think also stands is, how can we as professional associations try to shift the thinking of funders to try to ask about the presence of these sorts of policies from institutions that they fund? And that's something that we talked about when we saw the first draft of the survey report is, are there other programs that we can be doing to engage with funding organizations to try to find ways that we might influence change through their, the power that they wield over all of us. And then I think Joan Baldwin's the one who raised that point in that listening session. And she also raised the point that, perhaps there's a way to integrate these kinds of discussions in the AASLH STEPS program, where you're reaching some of those smaller organizations that might not have formal HR departments. And I know personally, I taught designed a new professional development course for the graduate students here that I taught for the first time this semester. And these are all issues that we talked about in that class, trying to prepare the next generation of public historians and folks who are already out doing internships in, sometimes precarious and vulnerable positions, to know what their resources are, because traditionally that has not been a conversation that's taken place in graduate training. So, hopefully coming up with some sort of sample, reading lists or resource lists that faculty can use in graduate programs might be another opportunity. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that? So another question that we got, is there data on the general demographics of those who work in the public history field, especially those compared to those currently studying it? That information may shed light on gender discrimination that is not as direct. And we don't have that information at NCPH. John, is that something you'd like to?
Yeah, so we just, thank you. We just did a membership survey, and so we don't have data about the field at large, but we tend here in the office at least, and I think in committees, equate our membership as a representative sample of the field. And one of the somewhat surprising findings from this most recent membership survey, and this is the first time we've done it in 5 years, is that it's 70% female. And we had known, I did a survey when I was at NCPH in conjunction with NCPH, AASLH, the AHA, OAH, and a couple other organizations. And in that survey back in 2008, we knew that 2/3 of the public history field was female. And in earlier ASLH surveys in the intervening years, it has always been, in the mid 60s, 60 to 64%, but it's jumped up to 70%, which I think reflects graduate programs. If you've ever spent any time around a museum studies or public history graduate program, it's probably more than 70% female. So I think that's, the field is shifting, and that is the situation we're in now is the reverse of what it was when public history was kind of invented as a term in the late 70s and early 80s. The field was the opposite. It was 2/3 male and 1/3 female.
And one thing that I'd just like to add to what John said is that the number of females in the field is growing, but there still is a lag behind people in power at organizations, it being strongly male versus female. So it's starting to change, but it's something that is not reflected, I don't think, in that 70%. And especially it's important when we're talking about gender discrimination and sexual harassment on, you know, who has at least the perceived power coming into the relationship.
Can I just jump in very quickly? And I appreciate that comment, Bethany. And I would say too, this is not what you were saying, John, but just to be clear, that I don't think that a demographic shift where more women are dominate the public history field, whether as managers or workers, means that these issues go away. And certainly, when we look at the survey, we understand that predominantly it's men who have been the perpetuator and women who've been the survivors and victims. But the reality is, of course, is that women can discriminate, women can harass, and I will speak from my own experience of having been discriminated against by a woman who was my boss at an organization. So I just don't want us to think that like a demographic shift towards more women in the workplace means that these issues just naturally go away. You know, there still needs to be all of those resources and policies in place.
Yeah, and I definitely was not saying that. I was simply responding to the question, what does the field look like? It could actually be an argument that it could get worse. And to Bethany's point, I do think things are shifting though. I looked at one of the groups that AASLH works with and facilitates and organizes is the State Historical Administrators Meeting, which is a gathering of the CEOs of state museums and state libraries. And I looked at the past 5 years of, you know, we get together once a year for like a 2-day conference, and looking at the attendee list, it's right now finally about 50-50 male female. 5 years ago it wasn't, but every year it's gotten a little bit closer to 50-50. And that's as new people, you know, basically the new attendees are mostly women. And so it is starting to change some of those power positions, but yeah, sure, it's going to lag for quite some time. One other statistic that came out of the survey was when this current survey, our survey, we asked what other factors besides gender that people thought that the incident of sexual harassment or discrimination might have been at play in the incident that they were describing. And so we asked about age, race, class, and disability. And 51% said they thought that age might also be, and you know, I think that's kind of such an obvious thing, but I think we should sit with it for a minute and think about that goes right to power dynamics. Like someone, the person that the kind of person that Bethany described, someone being new out of grad school, taking a leadership position at a small organization for the first time. You know, very young. And I think most of the situations that were described in the survey, I think that power dynamic of rank or time in the field and time at that organization was probably at play as well. And you know, I don't know what that means, but I think it's something that in any kind of resources we make available. And I think that's certainly taken into account in existing HR policies and things, that you have to give people a way to get around, you know, older people and people who outrank them in the organization. You have to give them a way to report either to HR or report to the board. So those are all things that we have to think about.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. And there is one. Well, there are two questions that I think might go together, Mary, that I would love you to answer. One person asked about what next steps are being considered to help create change, and another asked, is there an ethics statement that NCPH and or AASLH could issue regarding harassment and discrimination? For those of us who are doing public history in business or nonprofits that aren't history-based, it would be helpful to have something that states expectations of how public historians should be treated with respect, even if they are working in places that have differing views on gender and power. So Mary, I was wondering if we could end with 1 minute on sort of the larger work that your subcommittee is doing in terms of NCPH's ethics statement and policies.
Yeah, absolutely. So the subcommittee has been working on a variety of issues in addition to this survey. And so that includes developing policies for NCPH that are addressing these issues. That it also includes a professional code of conduct and ethics, sort of a statement of ethics as well. Those are in process at the moment. Other folks on our team have been working more directly on those than I have. So Kristen Dethridge, who's my co-chair, has been working on those issues. So I can't speak exactly to where they are in that process, but I know that that is being developed. So yeah, so we're working on that. And I think that one of the things that we see, and I think this conversation has helped to confirm, is that sort of statements of best practices and guidance and guidelines are coming from our professional associations are going to be really helpful for the workplaces that you all are in, because even though that NCPH and AASLH don't have the power to change any individual workplace, they do have the clout and the power to say this is the way things are supposed to be, and to use that to try to create what we're really talking about here, which is a much larger cultural change in our organizations and in our field.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Tammy and Heidi, for all of your work to digest this massive amount of data that we provided you with. Thank you to John and Bethany for being such fabulous partners in this work. Thank you to all of the volunteers that have been part of NCPH's subcommittee and AASLH's community that have contributed to this work, and know that this is a midpoint in the work for us where we can regroup with some more valuable information about where we can best focus our efforts. So please keep in touch with us. I believe AASLH is planning a session during their annual meeting in Buffalo this fall, so that the opportunities for conversation are not over, and we thank you for giving us your time today, and we hope to keep in touch. Thanks, everyone.